Welcome, everybody, today. Thank you for joining us, both to our incredible guests and our viewers. You should be able to put some questions in the chat if you need to. Um, we are here to discuss how language matters in the context of permanency, neurodiversity, FASD, and 2S LGBTQIA plus communities. This is a really important and meaningful conversation to have. I am Sarah. I'm going to be your host today. And before I get our amazing guests to introduce themselves, Tanya, Seth, and Tracy, I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining you today from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, including the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. I recognize that this land is covered by Treaty 18 and is also the home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As we gather today, I invite us all to reflect on the relationship to this land and consider how we can continue to learn from and support Indigenous communities in meaningful ways. Before we dive in one more time, I just want to go over a quick few definitions of the key terms we'll be using today. Permanency is defined as a secure, stable, and enduring family relationship for a child or youth that is intended to last a lifetime. Permanency ensures a child has a sense of belonging, full family membership, and a nurturing environment that supports their physical, emotional, cognitive, cultural, and spiritual well-being. Neurodiversity is a framework for understanding human brain function that recognizes natural differences in sensory processing, motor abilities, social comfort, cognition, and focus. These differences are viewed as variations in human neurology rather than diseases or disorders. We'll also be talking about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD. It is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition caused by prenatal alcohol exposure. It can affect individuals in many ways, including challenges with learning, memory, impulse control, and behavior. And finally, the acronym 2SLGBTQIA+, and it is an acronym that stands for Two-Spirit, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer, and Questioning, Intersex, Asexual, Aromantic, and other diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, including pansexual individuals. Okay, so now that we are grounded in some of these terms that are going to be important in our conversation, I would love to invite our guests to introduce themselves, share a little bit about why language matters to them and in the communities they are part of, and maybe share a moment when language used about you or your family felt either empowering or harmful. Who would like to start?
I'll go.
Great. Thanks, Seth.
As we talked about just before we started our little session here, I've actually put all my notes on paper. So if you catch me reading, it's just because I need to keep my thoughts in a the time frame that we have.
Of course.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing us into this space today. My name is Seth Compton. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the founder of OUTLoud North Bay. OUTLoud started as a response to something that I felt deeply connected with. It was part of my own journey. And I saw this in everyday to us LGBTQ lives and the youth that we serve here in North Bay. It was a need for a space where people could show up exactly who they were, who they're meant to be, and that language mattered to them. Um, I started my transition at 43 years old, so 7 years ago. It hasn't been an easy process. I think that a lot of folks think that youth that come out as transgender or non-binary, it's maybe being influenced by the internet or visibility or what that might look like. But my story started when I was 4 years old, and I just finished writing a book, and I'm hoping to be able to share it with folks at the end of April. And it's basically to take you on this journey with me. Um, I remember being 4 years old and telling my dad that I was asking him where my penis was and why I couldn't stand and pee like him. And he tapped me on the head and he said, "Because you're a girl, honey. You don't have those parts." And I just remember looking at him, being 4 years old, looking up to him and saying, "But I'm not a girl, Dad." So I think it's really important for us to understand that there are things that we're not going to ever understand, and that's okay. but there are ways that we can support, whether it's a phase that we think our youth are going through, we figure out a way to support it, and one of those things is language. And I think it matters because for me, it's often the first doorway to belonging. Um, the words that we can use often open doors or slam them shut. And for us, many of us queer folks, language has been used as a weapon in the past. Uh, so we want to be able to create spaces where language becomes the tools for the environments that we're in. It helps with identity, connection, and it's the core of why Out Loud was born, right? Is to make sure that the kids feel seen, valid, and safe. Um, so in our community, having the right words, whether it's someone's name, pronouns, or the way that we describe their families, this can be life-changing for most of us. And it's certainly been life-changing for me and the community that I support. This is not just about vocabulary, it's validation, it's safety and it's dignity. And that's why this conversation today matters so much for me. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Seth. Tracy or Tam, who would like to go next?
That's hard to follow. I can go next, Tanya, if that works for you. I'm Tracy Moisan. I'm the Senior Director of Operations here at Interwoven Connections. I'm privileged to be here today. I think I'm here in both a professional and a personal role. So on the professional side, I'm responsible for Interwoven's family support programs and the work that our incredible team does across the province with parents and caregivers. And personally, I'm a mom to three. Um, FASD is very much a part of our family, and understanding the impact of language as it relates to neurodiversity, helping my children as they've grown into young adults, um, understanding the impact that language can have on their identity, um, both in supporting and building. And something Seth said about, it can either open the door or slam the door shut. Or Seth, I think I'm paraphrasing, but that point you made, I think language can either be the barrier to for systems, or it can be a path to accessing the right services, support systems for our families. So that's probably why this matters to me.
Thank you, Tracy. And Tanya?
Hi, I'm a here as well as Tracy as a professional and on a personal level. I think there might be more than one adoptee, but I'm one of the only adoptees in the Interwoven Connections staff team. Um, I've also been I'm a psychotherapist and I work on the AFCA family support team, which is aggression toward family and caregivers in childhood and adolescence. I've been working in the adoption and fostering and everything like that kind of world for a number of years, as well as I've been working in the FASD world for almost 20 years. So, and I before that worked with children with complex special needs for a number of years before that. So there's a whole lot of crossover in this for me. Um, and I think I've experienced a language that is useful and not useful. It's funny because I know we're going to talk about real family in a moment, and that's one of my ones. Who are your real, who are your real parents is always an interesting thing for me. But I think another piece around language that is important, language matters and attitude toward language matters because language is constantly changing and that can feel overwhelming and frustrating and make us feel dumb. And I think what I'm learning for myself is just to be curious about language and um, not feel like I know better and be willing to make mistakes with language. So I just think those are kinds of some of the points that I'd like to make. I might even make mistakes as we talk about it today, but I'm really love it when people teach me. So I think maybe the attitude of learning matters in language.
Absolutely. That's a really great point, Tanya, is I'm excited to do these webinars because I learn from them too. So I'm just excited to get all the perspectives. And those personal perspectives are really what matters, right? So you did jump off a little bit with our first question. Like, I would love to hear everyone's thoughts about language like real family, how it's shown up in your experience, either professionally or personally. And what you've seen or felt its impact to be, and additionally labeling adoptees as lucky, and how that affects their sense of identity and their feelings of belonging and the way others perceive their experience, right? I think that language goes to way others perceive those people. And so, what do you think? I'm going to jump back to you, Tanya, probably.
I'd be happy to. This is a trigger one for me. But there's like a number of different layers. I actually want to go with lucky first, which is funny because I think what people often say when they say lucky is that there's a sense of being saved from something. And I'll tell you, I actually felt like I was lucky as an adoptee, but for a completely different reason. Sorry. Yeah. Um, I don't think any child wants to be saved from anything. That's a very outsider perspective. Every child wants to be loved by and live with their birth or bio family. Um, and sometimes that can't happen. And often adoption or other sorts of permanency journeys make good other options, sometimes not so good. But for me, lucky, I felt lucky to be adopted because I thought being born to parents was really boring. So I felt like my experience was more special. I'm really privileged to have grown up with that attitude. A lot of people in the adoptive world don't have that experience. Um, so that was I always felt lucky to know that my parents didn't have to have sex to have me. So I think it's just a horrible thing to have to think about that. The other part, though, the other word that really matters to me is the real world. Real word. And so many people have said to me something about my real parents. And I'll tell you that my answer to that is my real parents are the people who brought me up. They're the people who did the hard work of raising me. And I think sometimes it was hard. Um, so I think we really need to be careful about that word real because what does it mean? And I use the term birth parents to talk about. As an adult, because I'm all old and adoptions were not open when I was a child baby. When I was an adult, I was able to meet both of my birth parents. I'm more comfortable with birth parents. I know that's personal. Some people use the term bio parents. I've always found the word bio child to be interesting because that I am a biological child. So calling me an adoptive child or not calling me a bio child makes me feel like an outsider. But and I'm a real child and all of my parents that raised me were my real parents. That's my experience. I'd love to hear other people's perspective on that.
I can go next. I read your question initially, Sarah, about the lucky part, and literally, because I wrote some notes the same as Seth, and the word I wrote beside that was vomit. I just, I hear that, and it really is frustrating how often you do continue to hear that your kids are so lucky to have you. Um, and for me, it's such a strong reaction because I think two things. One, I think there's a whole constructed narrative there around adoption from a social lens and people's perceptions and stereotypes about adoption. that completely diminishes um, our kids' history, our kids' full history, and the complexities of why children enter care in the first place. And I think when we try to simplify, or when people use language that simplifies that down to talking about, oh, your kids are lucky, you really risk erasing their entire history. And I have a very similar reaction to forever family as well. Um, my kids had a family long before they met me, and they will continue to have a family long after. I am grateful that we have been able to expand a family around them, but their family includes us. It includes their birth or biological family. It includes their chosen family. Even when we think about it as adults, there are people in my life I refer to as family that I'm not biologically related to. And nobody thinks twice about my right as an adult to define who my family is. But we think we have to label this for kids. And instead of really trusting that our kids know who they're talking about and they don't need the label around them. And for me, it's that implied bias and judgment that often should be much more directed towards a system versus an individual that I really struggle with.
Seth, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I don't know how
You
this,
don't have to put up your hand.
yeah. Um, I just wanted to kind of jump off of what Tracy said. The forever family thing kind of sticks with me a little bit too, only because I haven't been adopted, but I spent some time as a child in foster care. And the word forever family for me can feel comforting for some kids. But for others, especially those experiencing like multiple placements, this can feel like a promise that's really hard to keep, right? And so when we look at how language matters, right? If you're telling these children that you're taking care of, that, we're forever family, and then something happens and they get pulled from your home or whatever that might look like, it could mean something very different for some of our kiddos, right? Um, Kind of just circling back to some of the other terms like birth parent or first parent can feel respectful for some families because it's an acknowledgement of their role, right? But without erasing caregivers who are currently providing that safety and stability. But for others, the term can feel like very clinical and distancing. And that's just, based on certain lived experiences um, but yeah, I just wanted to hop in there. But I love the forever family thing, but like it can mean so many different things for so many different folks.
And sometimes it sounds like adopting a puppy.
Yeah,
Was
yeah.
me.
And
Sometimes
and
like,
you know, sometimes we don't have control over what that looks like,
mm,
and things happen. Like what if for whatever reason, I took in a youth and became ill and, I wasn't able to meet their needs and they had to be moved out to somewhere else, or another, family member within, our circle. Like there's yeah, forever is just a very long word, even though it means well. It can mean heartbreak at the same time.
from
Like,
an adoptive parent also, and a new adoptive parent, my child's still quite young. When I hear like forever family, I consider all of our family now, and again going into the extended, and that includes the foster families he was
Yeah.
with. Right? The foster family is forever family. We're still in touch with them. So it kind of segues into my next term that to discuss is openness, and how we talk about openness when it comes to things like permanency, and how to respect those ongoing relationships and connections, both again as professionals and within the child's identity. So, yeah, let's talk about openness in our permanency worlds.
Who wants to go first on this one? I'll explain a little tiny bit about what openness meant personally for me, because as I said, as a child, openness wasn't that I knew nothing about my biological family, my birth family. They and partly because that was a choice that my adoptive mom made to not get information because I'm old. In the 60s, they gave the option to not have information. And so she didn't want to. She wanted me to be hers. And um, anyway, so I think that openness was something I craved. I wanted to know more of its openness and identity, I think get really tied together.
Yeah.
Um, and so in order for me to know a lot more of who I am, I wanted to see if I could open those doors, and I was able to, and it was for me mostly a really, really great experience. It's not for lots of people, and I recognize that. So it's complicated. Openness is complicated, but it is very much linked to identity. Who I remember receiving a picture of my birth mom, and it was the first time I looked like someone. Those things really matter. And meeting my birth father and feeling like there's a whole other part of my who I am that came from that, and from who he is, and that really matters. Even if we don't, I think sometimes these days when children in our uh, come from traumatic, they come from removals. I didn't come start out from that same sort of place. Um, but I think sometimes there's a lot more complexity to what are we linking and what does that identity mean and and I think it changes. My experience professionally is it really changes for every child, every person. Even in my own family, my birth mom has a stepson who was also adopted and never wanted to link. It's such a personal piece about what openness means and where someone wants to place their identity and link their identity. I don't know if that was very specific, but I think
Yeah,
other
no,
people here have more
there's
to
a
add
lot
to
of
that.
I want to call it pressure almost today,
Mhm,
in having openness right from the beginning, right?
mhm,
And regardless of how permanency placements happen, um, the goal seems to be really opening up and having more openness from those early ages. And when is it appropriate to discuss certain things about openness, right?
mhm.
I think there's something too, though, about, especially in the context of this conversation today about language, of separating openness as as a part of a system, like you said, Sarah, like this direction or move towards openness from as early as possible, as much as possible. And, we can debate lots of reasons for and against that, but I think the important part is, to me at least, is the part Tanya's getting to, which is that tie-in between how do you think about openness. And our partners at ACO, the Adoption Council of Ontario, use the term open-heartedness a lot.
Mm.
And I think that to me is almost some of the way to pivot the thinking here is from a language perspective and particularly how we as parents and caregivers talk to our kids about openness. It is that piece about how are we reinforcing or affirming their identity? Because so much of what, especially when you come back to our previous question about how birth parents or biological parents may be referred to, and how do we ensure that our kids aren't internalizing a narrative that is really harmful to their identity? And coming at that from a place of supporting our kids, regardless of what the system is directing about openness as an arrangement.
Yeah, I want to circle back to like when I think of permanency, I think of like a network as a whole rather than a destination.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then it's giving young people permission to hold all parts of their identity without shame or pressure, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
I like that without pressure piece
Yeah.
because I think one of the things I watch are kids who aren't ready. They can't hold all of the pieces of what openness means. it's really a complicated. I'm grateful that I didn't have to do that actually until I was older. I don't know if how I could have managed that. And I'm not saying that no one should, but I don't know how I would have managed. I got to do that journey in my 20s. I wanted to do it younger, but I think in my 20s, I was mature enough to manage both sets of families and all of the expectations. And I guess I think it's really hard or complicated for a child to manage how do I please and not offend. Kids are so good at picking up on those feelings. And I think about it again a long time ago, but my adoptive mom had really big feelings about why she wanted to adopt. And I think many, or if not most, adoptive people do have big feelings about why. It's a complicated process to get to adoption. And kids can feel that. They can feel the fears and the stresses and they have to manage that as well as their own feelings
Mhm.
and their own identity. There's a lot to that.
Mhm.
I think if nothing else, kids need a lot of support to make a decision that suits them and allow that decision to keep changing over time. But sometimes these adults that know very little about it make these big decisions and force kids to comply to those decisions.
Mhm.
And that can be really difficult and damaging, I think.
I'm going to skip down a little bit from the questions I sent and talk a little bit about, again, those systems and the professional language, because you did touch on a little bit where it says like placement versus apprehension,
Mhm.
taken versus given up, those sorts of like languages around. And again, the way children pick up on it and the way our families are perceived when we use terms like that or p other people use terms like that. So what do you think about that sort of language?
I feel like I'm on a little bit of a soapbox, so I'll make this point quick I think it's separating systems from people. Again, it's we come back so much to defaulting, talking about families, but talking about things through a system lens. You mentioned a few of them of placement, apprehension, taken. Probation is still used a lot when we're talking about adoptive families, that initial period, talking about families being on probation. And when we think about that, we are talking about languages that in any other setting is used to describe, a criminal justice system. And really having to be honest about what's the impact of our kids hearing language like that. And particularly if you are part of a racialized community or an underserved community where interaction with those systems creates real harm, and you then think about language through that lens and perspective. And I'm not going to pretend to say I have that lived experience, but I'm very aware how much of that language is so easily defaulted to and how harmful it can be.
Absolutely. What would you use instead of probation? Because we talk a lot about at Interwoven like terms that we could change so it doesn't sound so um, negative.
I think again, sometimes I think we have to remember people, not systems. We're early in our journey. We're getting started.
I have, I wrote down a few examples, so I'd love to be able to share just a few of
Please
them.
do.
So there's a few phrases that we can intentionally erase that can intentionally erase identity or oversimplifying someone's story. So I just kind of wanted to bring up some of the terms other than the ones that you've already mentioned, but like given up for adoption. So that applies abandonment rather than complex circumstances. Real parents suggest that only one set of parents is legitimate. um, Special needs child, kids are labeled all the time instead of describing the supports that they need, right? Which is super important. Like we know that every kid requires something. And so sometimes they just have a really difficult time expressing that, like, or being able to use the language to say, hey, listen, I'm not dealing with this okay, or this is what I need. Like kids can't ask, they're not processed, they haven't processed that yet, right? Failed placement was another one that we brought up, I guess, a little bit earlier, was, placing the blame on the child rather than the system or mismatching the support system. And high risk youth, that one drives me crazy. Other than describing the trauma responses, not every young person is at risk, but they have needs that we just haven't been able to figure out and meet yet, right? So these phrases can kind of flatten someone's lived experience and make it harder for them to feel very seen, and makes it very difficult to find the supports that we do need to help the kiddos when language isn't part of that process. So it's really important just to choose the words that care, and it's very easy to take something that looks very negative and turn it into a positive, right? When we talk about children with needs, we label them instead of saying, oh, in the positive way, this is what we can do. But we never go that route. It's always the negative first, before looking at what positives we can implement before making any changes. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That leads right into our next language terms, talking about special needs versus complex needs, and saying things the child struggles with, or labeling people that are struggling with neurodiversity or FASD. And again, that negative connotation. A lot of the time, maybe the children don't see themselves as struggling with these things. So, what do we think when people again, are putting that negative connotation first, saying things like struggle with? I personally like to use exceptionalities because I think that it makes it special. So that's the term I enjoy using because it turns it a little more positively. But again, you guys are the experts here. So what do you think about that when the focus is on that negative?
I have mixed feelings about this
Me too.
because I think I'm also uncomfortable with only using positive
Mhm.
because it is a challenge. And it can be a challenge because our systems and because our world doesn't fit well for exceptional anything. We like the norm and whatever that is, but we like people to fit into a certain curve, and the outliers on the curve are going to struggle no matter what. Um, so I don't know if I'm completely comfortable with only using positive language, and I don't- I'm going to be honest, I haven't come. I don't. I mean, again, I think it really matters what the individual wants,
Yeah.
and I just wrote down, we create language for our children because they don't have, based on something that Seth was saying there, kids don't come with language for themselves. They don't come with labels for themselves. They label themselves based on what they've heard. And so that is really powerful just to even think about describing what the experience is, because it is difficult and powerful, and how we might not have a word for many of these things, but describing and being curious about what the child's living experience is like. And that experience can change, right? So it can be really, really positive in some ways and really, really difficult in other ways. So I guess it's such a both end thing for me. I'm not comfortable with either either side.
I think for me, when I think about some of the youth that I've worked with over the years, labels can follow them
Mhm.
for an entire lifetime, right? So if we say this kid has bad behavior, and we know that those terms are used often, instead of like indicating that they're not bad, that they're trying to communicate distress or sensory overload or some of those things, right? That's probably where I was going with the more positive language versus all the other pieces. But yeah,
Totally
there's
agree. And I
so,
mean, that leaves space. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
oh no, no, you're right. Yeah.
It leaves space for change.
Yeah, for sure. And growth and, all the other things, less clinical, right? I always, I'm, I just I'm always trying to process things in a more holistic lens versus the clinical. I think that kids are able to adapt to that sort of language versus all the clinical stuff. And we're always using those labels and those clinical terms. And, it's very hard for families to digest a lot of that stuff. But if we bear down on some of the simpler terms and the easier language, it just makes it a little bit easier to support and find those resources that might be available to to aid some of those situations?
I think it's also about context of who are you talking to and when, because sometimes it is a clinical conversation and it probably should be. If I'm having a conversation with my child's doctor about a specific part of their medical history, I'm probably going to use words that are more linked to a medical model of talking about disability than I am about a social model. And I agree with everything Tanya and Seth are saying. It's there's a range. There is a when should we be and can we lead with talking about strengths and ability, and when is it actually really important to help our kids understand too why something might be a struggle, particularly in my case it might be thinking about it from a neurodevelopmental disability lens of explaining to a child math is really hard for you because your brain processes this differently. I think it's important to know that because otherwise they're internalizing the message they heard at school of you're dumb, you don't get math. Like,
Mhm.
I think it's really risky that we don't give our kids the knowledge to actually understand some of that. And it's interesting to me that in a lot of other cases, we wouldn't think about not helping a child understand a physical disability with understanding specifics about the medical or clinical part of that. But often, when we're talking about brain based disabilities or neurodevelopmental disabilities, we shy away from talking about some of those things. And it is just, I really think it comes down to context of who and when are you talking about and what's the conversation that needs to happen. The other part to me is really just centering the voices of the community who we're talking about and who the person is in front of you. So, what is the preference and the perspective of the communities that we're talking about, and how do we honor it and center those voices?
Do you find anything particularly like stigmatizing in that sense? Like when I don't know, we want to call it the invisible disabilities, right? Those ones that people don't see on the outside. Is there any like language around that that is especially stigmatizing, do you think, to the community, both for individuals, children, and as caregivers?
The one that I always come back to and that I think is just harmful no matter what is when we talk about normal. When we talk about normal versus, and there's a very, very thin window of what society considers normal, um, versus how we talk about everyone else who doesn't fit in with that very, very confined view of what is normal or acceptable. Um, so that's probably, Tanya talked earlier about the reaction to real or forever. And normal's the one that gets me of, and again, I'm often still shocked at how often it just rolls off someone's tongue.
Yeah, absolutely. And that again leads into the next little bit under this umbrella of we talk a lot. Tanya talked a little bit about AFCA at the beginning. We touch a lot on aggression towards family and caregivers in childhood and adolescence. We use the acronym AFCA. And a lot of people on the outside, when they see families whose kids maybe do have FASD or some neurodiversity, they just see it as bad behavior. It's not enough parenting. There's not enough discipline in those bad behavior versus, again, sometimes labeling it in the clinical sense of this is AFCA, and how the brain and processes things. So, how do you feel when people are just labeled for bad behavior?
Can I share a little experience I've had?
Please.
Um, I worked in a group home down south, and it was teenage boys, and most of them were highly medicated because most of them were diagnosed with FAS. And one of the things I found so beautiful working with these kids was that, when we sat and took the time to listen, um, and engage with them in any sort of activity, they just wanted to be seen. They wanted to be heard, right? And it was so simple for me to walk into that house with seven teenage boys that were all highly medicated, all diagnosed with the same thing. Um, some of them were in adoption homes, and the adoptive caregivers just couldn't handle the behavior, right? But in my mind, in my heart when I came into work every day, it was about meeting where they were at, meeting them where they were at, listening to what their needs were, checking in on them, even though they were medicated. Um, their needs were still not being met, and there wasn't anybody that stopped to listen to them. So I would walk into that house, it could be complete chaos. But the minute I walked in, they respected me so much because showed up for them every single shift. I sat down, I helped them cook dinner, we did crafts, I engaged with them every single day. And not a lot of the other workers took that time. So when they came in to relieve me, the kids were having a meltdown because I was leaving, for my shift. But it just goes to show you that when we take a minute to soften our environments and to really kind of put the work in as a caregiver, what that could look like and how that can change our entire environment and our experience with our kids. Um, so yeah, that was just, one of the things I'll never forget because I left that home to move up to North Bay and it was sad for me to go. And, one of the kids up, he actually flipped the whole kitchen table at dinner when I was sharing that I was leaving, but I write them letters, I stay in contact with them, so that they know that they have that one person that they can always, you know, send a letter to and express their feelings because they know at the other end I'm going to listen, I'm hearing them, I'm seeing them. So sometimes it's not about I mean, there could be behavior there, but we're not listening. So
Mhm.
I think to go with that, most of the people, one of the first things that I learned in working in the FASD world is, and I think probably that language, feeling bad, feeling not like you fit in and you desperately want to fit in. Most people with FASD, most of my clients with FASD, what they need first when they come into my office is to feel liked.
mm,
And I think we don't do a lot of that. And I think what you're describing, Seth, that piece of taking the time to get to know an individual, you can't understand an invisible disability if you don't like or know the individual. You can't understand it in any way. I mean, it's hard to understand what you can't see, but that time and that respect and that liking experience will help a lot. And every one of us behaves is our best in the safety of a relationship of like.
I have a question here from Sandy, and she asks, what do you think of the term dysregulated for an FASD child who is not behaving in an accepted way?
that's a loaded question.
Right.
I have thoughts. Who wants to go first?
I think Tracy sounds like she wants to go first too.
Well, I think there's a few things in there. I think, first of all, even just talking about dysregulation is a really general term that can mean a lot of different things. And again, it assumes a very narrow definition of what does regulated look like in a
Mhm.
typical situation. So what dysregulated might look like in one child may look very, very different in another. So from a language perspective, I think you really risk not like what are you talking about in that case. And when we haven't talked about it much here, but I previous to the work that I'm doing now had was the director of our national consortium on AFCA and some of the work that came out of that. And we did a consultation with over 100 families, including youth across the country, to talk about their experience with patterns of aggression and aggressive behavior. And so many things that we heard there were around needing to find language that was more specific to actually describe here's the we're not talking about somebody who had a bad day. We're not talking about somebody who um, was feeling kind of off and maybe made said something or did like we're not talking about one off. When we're talking about AFCA specifically, we are typically talking about more intensive patterns of behavior. Um, and where I'm going with this is we were talking with a young person who had experienced care, um, had struggled with behavior that would be called AFCA under that definition. And her saying to us, you're worrying so much about the language, I just need you to help. And what can you do? And I think that's where really general terms, it's not often clear to somebody what's the support that's needed, what's the help that's needed for this child. Um, and to something Seth said, what's the need that's not being met? So I think yeah, I'm going to stop. I think Seth and Tanya probably have other stuff to say.
Do you want to go, Seth, or shall I?
I mean,
Rock, paper,
I'll
scissors.
kind of, I just wanted to toss in a little example that I had written here, like, and this kind of it'll tie in a little bit, but I'm sure you can spin off whatever I put out here. But like when I think about like if a file says frequent behavioral issues, our response is often discipline, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if we say requires sensory safe environments and predictable routines, our response becomes supportive planning. So for me, when I was dealing with this individual in the group home, it was about finding all the ways that I could support the individual and learning more about his diagnosis and maybe what those needs like look like, right? So it, it becomes it's a whole journey. It's a process with all of us, right? Especially as a caregiver. We've been gifted these beautiful children and we want to be able to give them the best life possible. But that means forever learning for us, right? Because we have to put in the effort to understand where those needs are and how we meet them, right? That's just me.
I think I react to the dysregulated idea only because I think we have a really bad idea of what regulated means.
Okay.
Regulated is not calm. Regulated is my nervous system and my behavior are matching what the demand is. So if I'm not feeling safe and I'm acting in a self-protective way, I'm regulated. If I'm in danger and I'm calm, I'm dysregulated. And I think we we have put this idea that dysregulation means poor behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes regulated means behavior that doesn't look well behaved, but is protecting what I need to protect in a way that I've learned to protect myself, and I'm doing the best I can in the moment. So, I think dysregulation is a good description of what's going on, and it might help me understand what's underneath it. But a dysregulated child implies sometimes a badly behaved child and not a calm child. And I don't agree with that.
So I think that's where Sandy was coming from because accepted was the one in accepted behavior, right?
Hmm.
One in brackets there. So thank you all for that answer. I appreciate that. Um, Next, I kind of want to move into, we've talked a lot about how this language can shape identities. So I want to talk a little bit more about the language behind gender identity and inclusion, things like pronouns. Yeah, Seth's ready. And so how can these systems ensure that their language is inclusive of identity? And I'll move into more questions, but how should caregivers go about supporting youth? And what language changes can really make the difference for children who are really just trying to identify, like they're really trying to learn their own identities? Yeah, Seth, I think he's ready.
Yeah, I'm going to share what I wrote just so that it stays on track. Um, I mean, I could talk about this for days because this is my jam. But so permanency systems have a responsibility to create environments where young people feel seen, respected, and safe. Inclusive language is one of the most powerful tools that we have to make this happen. It starts with honoring a young person's name and pronouns, so every time without exception. Um, and I know that there's some learning involved around this, and that's okay. Using a young person's chosen name instead of their dead name isn't just a courtesy, it's a matter of dignity and how for many mental health and for mental health and safety. Um, it's just that one small thing. And I know that there is a process, especially for caregivers, to understand that, even we've been given a birth name and some things kind of change throughout the years, and that's okay. And understand that the percentage of self-harm and suicide risk and all the other things that come along with this, it's not just a chosen name, it's who they are, right? So we can eliminate a lot of those statistics if we are that one person that shows up for them, right? Even if we don't understand it, and even if we think it's a phase, we're going to support it anyways, right? I feel like systems can also build inclusive language into their policies and paperwork. Intake forms should allow more than just male and female, and they should ask pronouns the same way that you would ask for a phone number or emergency contact information, right? I hate the word normal, like Tracy said, but the more we normalize these things, it just becomes an everyday thing, right? And we don't have to worry about, feeling anxious to ask those questions. Um, Staff training is essential too. So when adults understand why language matters, they're better equipped to support youth whose identities may evolve or who may not feel safe sharing everything right away. So we want to ultimately be able to signal to the young people that we're taking care of, you belong, and we're committed to honoring who you are, right? I think that's really, where a lot of that aligns. And some caregivers struggle with that because maybe it doesn't align with the way we were brought up, or maybe it's doesn't align with our political views or culture or religious views, and that could be very difficult. But honoring our gifts is, by doing that with language, can save someone's life. And I know that sounds so dark and deep, but I've been there. I've walked that, path. And I think that if I had outside of my dad, if I had other support systems or people that recognize where my red flags were, it would have changed a lot of the courses of some of the things I experienced. One with my mental health, two with my safety. Maybe I wouldn't have tried to pop a bunch of pills and end my life. Like those sort of things are very real. And, if we can just honor and respect and love unconditionally, um, it can change someone's world. So yeah, just small shifts in language can completely change how your space evolves, especially for trans and gender diverse youth. And by doing that, you can just ask, what name and pronouns would you like me to use for you? How can I help you? Where do you need support? Just very simple. A lot of caregivers, though, are afraid to ask those questions. It's like, when a lot of parents like, how do you talk about safe sex and consent and stuff with the kids? I'm like, I just talk about it, right? There's no shame, there's no embarrassment. Like, if we're not teaching our kids, they're going to learn from the internet or somewhere else. And I want to be the one to be able to share those conversations with them so that I can, share my experiences. My parents didn't have those conversations with me when I was growing up. So there was a lot that I had to learn on my own. But I've raised my kids completely different, right? We sit at the dinner table and we talk about all sorts of things. And that's the time of day that they open up to us. If they're dealing with something, we've made that commitment, at dinner time to have those really off the wall conversations. And it's okay around food, right? Just talk about it. So yeah, I think that, just one of the other things too is that we really try to use gender neutral terms. When I introduced myself this morning, I said, "Good morning, everyone." I didn't say, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," because I don't know who's in the space. So I want to be respectful of how people identify and creating those environments and using the language where we're using everyone, folks, instead of boys and girls. Like I think about all the gender diverse kids in school right now that are, you know, uh, not in high school yet, but the teachers are still like, okay, boys and girls line up, right? Like, how's that going to put someone, if they don't align with being a boy or a girl, where do they line up? So if we're, hey, folks, I need two lines, right? And the kids will line up in two lines. They don't need to associate their gender with, how the teacher wants to form a line. So, yeah, it's just, I mean, I could talk about this stuff all day. Um,
I
but
do have
when we
a
do,
question for you, Seth, from one of our viewers. Danielle asks, Seth, can you comment on the use, and I'm just trying so you can see what what she's written. Can you comment on the use of preferred pronouns? I look at preference as meaning that someone has a choice to use it or not, as in, would you prefer coffee or tea? I prefer tea, but I'll take coffee if that's all you have. Should it not be so much preferred, but just should be?
So preferred pronouns is a lot different than preferred name. So I don't prefer to be called Seth. A lot of documentations you'll see preferred name, legal name. My chosen name is Seth, so I am Seth. My preferred pronouns are he, him. Some people will identify with a combination of pronouns. So sometimes they have he, they, or she, them, So we want to make sure that we just ask the question and don't feel afraid to do it. I would rather someone ask me what my chosen name and my preferred pronouns versus misgendering me or using the incorrect pronouns, right? It just, again, we're going back to creating a safe space, right? And we're providing that environment so that we can have these conversations openly. We've talked about openness in all morning long and how important that can be, especially to our kids, just allowing them to share that information with you as a checkbox, right? Like that's going to give us the tools to be able to provide the environments that they need, get the resources that allow us to, you know, um, help the youth in whatever direction and path they take.
Great. Tanya and Tracy, do you have anything to add to this part of the discussion?
No, but I could listen to Seth talk for a long time.
I have a little thought, and that is about, what it's like to be a person learning. It's uncomfortable being the person learning, but my discomfort is pretty minimal
Yeah.
comparatively. So being able to be curious and being able to apologize for getting it wrong doesn't seem that painful compared to walking a journey of trying to fit a society that's got some pretty rigid ideas
Yeah.
when you don't fit those rigid ideas. So I'm going to try to default to the person who needs more support than I do to just be curious and learn.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I walked with parents who have to go through a grief process when they think that they had a little girl and now this little girl is saying, no, I identify as male. That there's a grief, there's a loss. They chose a name. They put thought into, there's a grief process. I can honor that, but also really honor the fact that this child going through trying to figure out their identity has a bigger hurdle. I can accidentally say the wrong pronoun and say, oh, sorry, I goofed. Because I'm embarrassed when that happens because I really don't want to do that. But my brain's slow. It's got used to a certain thing. It's got to learn a new thing. I think I sometimes have a fear that I'm going to hurt people, so I can stay out of the conversation rather than facing that fear. And I'm trying to learn how to lean into that fear and just go for it and be messy and clumsy and apologize and learn and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So I can only come to it from the person learning. I'd love to hear what you think, Seth.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that because fear is very real. And I think that when we look at what our political climate looks like today, parents are freaking out they don't know. I mean, obviously they want to keep the safety of their kids number one priority. But when we're worried about what our neighbors think or what school thinks or what, grandma thinks or whatever, it goes beyond that, right? And so we go into protective mode and we try to do the best that we can. But when you brought up making mistakes, like when I first started my transition, I was working at Walmart, and a lot of seniors, a lot of older folks work at Walmart, and so I had some really beautiful relationships with these older folks, and I was terrified to tell them that I was starting this journey when I had been there for so many years. And I remember one lady, she was so happy that I just found myself, and she was pushing me to wear my new name tag and don't worry about what other people are going to think. And, so then we incorporated, I was the one that incorporated pronoun pins through the whole Walmart Canada, right? We started here and then it rolled out to all their stores, but it's just the little things, right? But when I think about making a mistake, you just apologize and you move on. It shows that you've made an effort, that you caught yourself, that you're being mindful. And that grief thing that you brought up is so real. I mean, I've been married 20 some years now with my wife. And when I started my transition 6 years ago, the one thing that scared me the most was whether my marriage was going to survive, whether my kids were going to be okay with the transition, even though, we've had our boys through a fertility clinic and my wife carried both. It was a conversation that we've always had from day one. So even though we were together at a very young age, I kept reminding her that I wasn't this person. I'm still this person, but I'm really not this person in this shell, and I don't know how to explain it because the language wasn't there. And she said, "Okay, well, when you can explain it and when you're there, let me know, and we'll figure it out." And so I took her out for lunch 7 years ago, and in the middle of lunch, I just started crying, and she looked at me and she said, "You're ready. So if you're ready, we'll have a conversation with the boys and we'll see and we'll move forward." So I remember my one son said, like, just do what's going to make you happy. Don't worry about the rest of us. We'll be fine. And that just validated how I raised my kids. Like they were okay. I had to come out to them a second time. And from day one, I let them know that they were born into a family that just loves unconditionally, and that's the way we were going to raise them. And we treat people like we want to be treated, and that was it. And they haven't wavered from that. So that just goes to show you that we've spent the time to learn together. I didn't know a lot about trans history or anything, but when I started embarking on my own personal journey, I wanted to make sure that I had all the tools, and I can only share with you my lived experience. I don't know, a lot of people say that it's a choice to be trans. And I can assure you that, I wouldn't choose a life where I'm hated and discriminated and murdered. This is not an identity that somebody would choose
Mhm.
so that you can see, the lists of people that are murdered across the world that identify just like me. You know, I'm a cool parent. I have a job. I drive a truck. I play golf. I suck at video games. I do all the same things that you do, but because when I share my identity, it may change how you see me, but I'm still the same human. And I think that's where we need to be very mindful with the kids that we're gifted with, is that, you know, we just show up for them. No matter how we do it, we just find a way. And we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. It's part of the process. If you have a kid that comes out to you as trans, non-binary, gay, lesbian, whatever, you say, "Listen, this is new for me. I'm going to learn with you. Please help teach me what I need to know," right? We can do it together. And those are very simple conversations that we can open up with our kids, and then we have that, and we're empowered by that. And then we take that and we empower our outside family members and our friend circles and all the other connections that we know and have that are a part of this process with us, and we give them the tools to be the best versions of themselves, right? But I get it. It's not unless we're affected by it, it's very hard to understand. Like, when I do a lot of speaking engagements, I always ask the room, how many people in here have been affected by cancer? Raise your hand, and I have 95% of the room raising their hand. And I always ask them, like, how many people in here cared about cancer before your loved one was affected or diagnosed by cancer? And nobody raises their hand, right? Because they weren't affected by it. They didn't care. They didn't donate. They didn't do a 5K run. They didn't. But now they're doing all the things because their loved one is affected by cancer. So when I use that analogy, I remind parents and caregivers that when someone comes out to you, it's the same thing. We're going to take it, we're going to run with it, we're going to learn, and then we're going to find ways that we can support our kiddos, right? Or any other loved one for that matter. Very simple to do, but it takes work, and we have to be willing to learn more than what we've been taught. That's what, gives us our own knowledge bundle, right? To move forward in any sort of aid that we're going to provide, whether it's our other families or, friends, relatives.
You
That's right.
talked a little bit about those like red flags, and this kind of goes out to the group, not just in terms of gender identity, but identity in general for, again, the youth in our care, on permanency journeys, and what kind of things can caregivers look out for to support their youth when they're coming, trying to, again, identify themselves, whether, again, that's their gender or as an adoptee, or is there any of those flags that we can look out for as caregivers?
I think for me is just, when youth are distant and isolated and kind of like checked out, I feel like sometimes we haven't created that safe environment to allow them to share those feelings with us. Or sometimes it could be the way we're talking, right? So if I'm using slurs, or if I'm, having a conversation with another adult that reflects something that, whatever, and our kiddo hears us have that conversation or using certain words, um, that could put them right back in their shell and say, hey, I don't feel safe here. I'm not going to share this information with my caregiver, right? So like for me, it's just about creating that safe space.
I think
Can
there's
I add to
also,
that? Oh, so you go,
no,
Tracy.
you go ahead.
I was going to say one of the challenges, though, in the adoption or permanency world is many children have learned that lack of safety before they came to us. And helping reorganize safety in someone who started out unsafe sometimes is actually almost impossible. So I just want to say we have to be a little bit careful around suggesting that all caregivers can create that safety because sometimes caregivers can't,
Yeah.
but they keep trying. And also, sometimes that safety can't come within caregivers, but creating a bigger community around, making sure that the child has other people. I had other people that I could talk to that weren't my caregivers, that were really important to me, that created my safety growing up. So sometimes as caregivers, what we can do is create it's painful because we want to be the safe place and we are a safe place, but our children's nervous systems can't interpret safety at home because they learn to protect themselves at home. So they might be able to feel safe in other places. And so sometimes the best thing we can do as caregivers is create safe connections outside of the home.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you have something to add, Tracy?
I just think as a parent caregiver too, it's also somebody, I don't remember which one of us said before the idea of normalizing, but all the things we've talked about, demonstrating yourself, being curious, normalizing having the conversation, normalize having the conversation around the dinner table, whatever those uncomfortable conversations are, that you're open, you're learning, you're curious, and reflecting on what did that feel like and why didn't that? And I think, there's I think all of us as parents and caregivers have an obligation to demonstrate that kind of self-advocacy to our kids, um, so that they can learn it. And I strongly agree with what Tanya just said of we shouldn't be the only safe space. In fact, our other obligation is creating those safe communities and networks. We all need that kind of community around us. But I think in particular, creating it for our kids, that again, it's the modeling and demonstrating it for them.
Absolutely.
Our children
Positive.
become a product of our environment, right? So
Exactly.
yeah.
Do any of you have any recommendations for the caregivers watching about how to create that environment? Again, especially around like inclusive language, respectful language, and creating those support systems. Like, would you talk to family and friends first about supporting those kiddos? How would you go about
Mhm.
that? Just because we're always so proactive and what's the word? I'm gonna miss the word because it's Thursday morning. But
I think
just creating those
I can
spaces.
offer one very practical one is sometimes it's looking at who's already in your kid's life and who does your child already have a relationship with? And then can you do some behind the scenes work about educating, informing, talking about things that you think may be on your kid's mind that maybe they can bring up. We've talked a lot about FASD over the last hour. I very intentionally have provided people in my kids' life with credible information about FASD and understanding their brains and understanding strategies and understanding behavior that looks like this is actually because of this need. And me being able to do that in the background means that when my kid goes to go have those conversations, the person they're choosing to talk to is starting from a place that is already centered around my child. I don't need to organize the relationship, but I can help provide information that will support those conversations.
That.
I had another thought and it got interrupted. Sorry.
Sorry.
No, it wasn't you. Um, yeah.
Well,
I
Tanya,
think,
thank
oh, I know. Actually, no, I know
Oh,
what it is. Sorry,
okay, okay.
sorry. Don't lose it. Tracy hangs out with me enough that she laughs at me because she knows this is just what I'm like. I think that I watch, and I think about it with my own children. I watched who liked my child.
Yeah.
Again, it's that liking thing. If someone likes your child, then you can try to go behind the scenes and go, you know what, my child needs you. Can I help you to commit and do, can we create space for this relationship because he needs this relationship? Especially, I'm going to say through adolescence.
Yeah.
If you find people that they just click and there's something they do in common that they like doing, foster that because we all need people outside of our parents, especially through that adolescent phase when our job is to start pushing away from our parents and to form our own identity separate from our parents. Having other people that our kids know like them, are excited to see them, want to be with them, that has a huge resilience impact, but it also can help create that safe space where kids can actually talk about what's going on. So then if a parent's noticing something and curious, but knows that if they directly ask their child about it, they're going to get a reaction, they can get that other person to ask that question. And that can open up the conversation because I think sometimes we know, but we also know our kids need to open up other places. How do we find others? So I'm looking at the question, how do we find these other people and offer this to our kid? That is probably the biggest thing our society doesn't do community well these days.
Yeah.
Finding supporters is really difficult. But I think asking for little things, like if there's a teacher or there's an EA or there's just anyone, a neighbor, anyone that you feel like could do, even someone at a distance that will talk online or play a game online with our child and have conversation that way. There are some really creative ways, and it doesn't have to be a massive time commitment to that other person. But if
Yeah.
you find anyone that will plug in and you can form a relationship as well, you can then be a team supporting your child.
I've seen people post on like Facebook mom groups, like, I'm looking for a friend for my kiddo. And here's
Mhm.
what they like. Would your kiddo also enjoy these things? Please message me. And I think that's really brave to reach out like cold calling people. I think that's amazing, but it can build connections. I've seen it happen. So um, sometimes it takes a bit of creativity, but again, it goes back to the language of who are those people using the language that the child or adolescent is really, vibing with, right? So,
I've even seen ads for parents looking for other parents that have like neurodivergent youth or
Yeah.
those sort of things, right? So you eventually find your people. But yeah, I love what Tanya mentioned. Like we have to rely on a support system, a whole network, because we can't do it on our own, but we do the best that we can.
yeah, and everybody here is learning from each other. And I'm just gonna say, like, we're coming to the end. So if anybody has any questions for anyone on our panel, please stick them in the question and answer or in the chat, and we'll be sure to ask them. But kind of lastly, again, we've talked about respectful language, what that looks like, actions in families, communities, and ongoing learning. But if you could change a word or a phrase commonly used, what would it be? What would you want to replace?
I can go first, and partly because I have the first part, not the second part. Um, I think we talk about kids being resilient, and especially kids that have experienced trauma, being resilient or resiliency. And it just gives me that little bit of backup because, or I stiffen up because I think what we're often talking about is kids who have really experienced some horrific things or trauma, and in many ways we're using it to say, like, again, it's that implied piece of look how strong they are, instead of saying why did that have to happen and what should have happened and what systems let this family or child down that this happened. And so I think resiliency often gets masked. When it gets used, it masks things that never should have happened in the first place, and that we really put too much weight on kids by saying, well, look how resilient they are. Actually, they shouldn't have ever had to be. I don't know what to replace it with.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a tricky one.
Well, I think understanding what resilience is about, again, it's
Yeah.
it's it's just misused.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
misused. It's not, it's like dysregulation. It's not understood well, and so we're using it the wrong way. It
Yeah.
makes us feel good using it.
That's what I mean. It becomes this kind of really like there's a little bit of a savior connotation there too of
Mm,
they're so strong.
good for you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So, Tanya, do you have any terms that you really wish wouldn't be used anymore?
Oh, I mean, I think I do, but I'm uncomfortable in some ways saying, man, I sound wishy-washy, and I'm not wishy-washy because I have strong opinions, but they're mine, right? I don't like the term real, hate it. It never needs to be used. I am real. All of my parents are real. I am biological. All of my parents are biological. Now I get it. Bio is one way to describe it, and I'll use that word sometimes. Um, and also, I just want to put a little plug in for allowing humor. I love to say I grew up in a family where I'm store-bought and my brothers are homegrown. There's really a lot of space for humor in a lot of this, and when we can allow people to have humor and lead with humor for language they like to use for themselves and in their story, that can be really useful too.
I'm gonna add to that real quick. Because my youngest son, who is 17, tells all of his friends that he's older than everybody in the house because he's spent most of his life in a test tube. And I was like, why would you say that? And he's like, because that's how it's his comic relief, and it's, the
Yeah.
way he shares his journey, and that's okay. I
Mhm.
find it strange, but whatever. you know? But it
That
never gets
language
old.
works for him.
Yeah.
That's great. I love that. Is there any specific terms that you don't love, Seth, that you wish would just go away?
Well, I think, we talked about it when someone asked the question earlier about preferred pronouns or preferred name. Um, like preferred name comes up quite a bit, even on documents. And like, I don't prefer to be called Seth. I am Seth. So it's my chosen name. And I know that we didn't touch on dead naming or anything earlier. I had that written down in some of my sheets, but um, it makes it really difficult for kids to feel seen and heard if you're always misgendering them or dead naming them, right? So I know it seems like a lot, and like Tanya brought up earlier, we're going to make mistakes, and it's okay to do that. As long as the youth knows and sees that you're trying, right? That effort can go so far. Um, yeah, I just put like I have something written. I'm gonna read it just so that I don't miss out. Just respectful language shows up in every moment, every day, everyday rooms. It's how we introduce our kids using proper pronouns, chosen names. It's like teachers saying good morning, everyone, instead of boys and girls. It's a social worker updating a file so the youth never has to see their dead name printed on a document again.
Mm.
Like these things are very real. So respectful language, it's consistent. It doesn't disappear. It's when someone isn't in the room, right? We use it no matter what, even though if it's new or unfamiliar. And it's backed by policies that protect the youth from being misgendered or outed, which is really important, especially if, we're dealing with paperwork and, maybe additional resources. It could be clinical, it could be outside youth centers, it could be whatever, right? But we want to make sure that this is the way we're introducing them so they feel real. And yeah, just so, I mean, it's rooted in everything that we do, right? It's just I think every kid deserves to be recognized in their own skin, and it's just really important to find ways to focus on that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in, so you're all safe there. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in, and I think everyone's really touched on that language matters, but it is also ongoing learning. It's something that evolves and shifts and changes, and as long as we're putting in that effort, that's what really matters. So, again, thank you all for being here and sharing your expertise. I really, really appreciate it. And for everyone watching and asking questions, we appreciate it. I believe this will be distributed to those who registered and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel later for those who missed it. But thank you again, Seth and Tracy and Tanya. It was so great to talk with you all, and we'll see everyone at our next webinar.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
Sarah.
much. Have a
Take
Have a
great
care,
day.
great
everyone.
day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.